enough.
I'm Halivni for Toldos Israel, sitting with...
You'll have to speak up. It's a big of a hush here. Go on.
I'm Halivni from Toldos Israel, sitting with David Azrieli in Tel Aviv. Why don't you tell me a little bit about growing up, your family, in particular, hearing about Zionism or Palestine for the first time as a young boy?
Well, I was born in a small town in Poland, north of Warsaw, about halfway between Warsaw and the old Prussian border. It was a little town with about 5,000 Jews and about 5,000 Poles, each one living together and separately. Our home was a home full of the ideals of what's happening in Palestine and the Halutzim who went over there with the prominent JNF box for collecting coins, songs, and quite a bit of Hebrew and Yiddish on top of the Polish. Particularly my mother, and my father too, was very interested and very keen with what's happening in Palestine. She followed all the young people from the little town. Incidentally, the town was called Makuf Mazowiecki.
And what year was this? What year? When?
Well, I was born in 1922, and I'm talking about the years probably until the beginning of the war, which is 1939. In the 1930s, after I finished elementary school, and I was sent to what was called a gymnasium or high school for a year in Warsaw, where we also studied Hebrew, and of course quite a few subjects connected with Judaism, Kolel Tanakh, and others. Later on, they established a gymnasium in Makuf, so I came back to the town, and that was not a Hebrew-Jewish gymnasium, it was a Polish one, which I continued my studies. In my years of growing up at home, maybe between the age of 12, 13, I was a very voracious reader. I read a lot. And there was a certain period of time when I was not quite sure whether the direction of the Jewish people should go entirely towards Palestine, a free home, although the atmosphere at home and the feelings were there. And I was leaning more to the left. I felt that the solution could be a universal solution, both for Jews or non-Jews, for a better and more idealistic way of life. I will come to it later when I'll explain to you that those ideas were quickly evaporated during the war, when I came in direct contact with what was happening in the Soviet Union. And the study of Hebrew, of Tanakh, the old songs that came to Poland from Palestine, which I still remember and cherish, about the building of the Namal, of the port, about the stories of the Kinneret in Jerusalem, were a very important part of my growing up and of my thinking and the way of life at the time.
Do you know where your mother became a Zionist from, or how she came about?
Well, I cannot recall particularly a special moment why and how my mother became a Zionist, although most of her sisters, cousins in town and in the periphery were very much Zionists. They were very much enamored with what was happening in the emerging issue in Palestine in the 30s.
Do you remember any Zionist figures coming through? I know you lived in a small town, but do you remember any?
Yes, of course, yes. Not only do I remember, but I can tell you that it was a very important event when one of the Halutzim came back for a visit, or some other emissaries from the Yishuv or from Warsaw came to town, or the special events which we had in the only hall for performances, which they call the Lutnia, which is the name of in Polish, of a harp, where performances were made by visiting artists from Palestine, and of course also performances of our own Zionist organizations for all the holiday and all the events that were connected with things in Palestine at the time. I do remember a particular event when a Yemenite came to town, and to us it was, first of all, it was new that there were Jews in Yemen, let alone to see one coming back from Israel. It was a big event, and I remember it very well.
What types of Zionist organizations were there? Were you part of any youth movements?
They were all there, starting from the Shomer HaTzayir to the Young Judea, to it was a typical town where the different movements and the different organizations, including a very large Haredi community, I believe that they belong to the movement of the Gerer rabbi, but that's kind of stuck in my memory.
And did you or your family think at any point at that period of moving to?
We were all active. My brothers, my little sister participated. We studied Hebrew, we even spoke some Hebrew. And the Yishuv and the achievements and the songs and stories and about breaking ground, starting Yishuvim, Kibbutzim, were prominent in our lives.
Can you recall, as a high school student, if you were dreaming of what your future was going to be, or what you were going to do, if everything would have remained kind of in the same status? Can you remember what?
As a high school student in Warsaw, which I attended, a high school connected with training of Hebrew teachers, and the emphasis on Hebrew and general studies was very strong. I always lent to drawing and painting, and I was fascinated with the journals of fashion which I found in the workshop of my father, I did not have any specific ideas of exactly what I'm going to do or what I will be, but I did lean towards the arts, the painting, the drawing, of which I excelled. I did well, and I was even praised for it in school.
Can you tell me about the day when everything changed?
Yes, of course. Everything changed dramatically in the month before September 3rd, when the war broke out. There were changes, of course, before, and the changes were in greater anti-Semitism by the Poles and the news that came from Germany and what was happening over there after 1933. By 1939, I was a boy of 17 when the war broke out. And when the war broke out, my parents, my mother, decided that we, the boys, should not stay in Makov. We should go east, away from the Germans. And the idea was to go as far east and then south to Romania, and from there across to Palestine. So the objective was to reach Palestine at that time. My older brother, who was already 19, was already recruited by the Poles to some works connected with the military, like fortifications, and he was not home. My younger brother, who was 15, we were all 2 years apart, came with me and another friend. Actually, we were the four of us. And we started out on the, if I remember correctly, on the 3rd of September, or the 4th, because Makov was quite close to the Prussian border, and we felt that the Germans are coming, invaded Poland and coming close. And our parents spent the night fixing up our clothes, giving us money and things, and walking very early in the morning, it was still dark, walking with us to the outskirts of the little town, and crying and bidding goodbye. We never expected not to see them again. In fact, we did see our mother, but this is a story for later on, but not our father anymore. And we started on our way. We started on foot. And we were always, as I described in the book which my youngest daughter Dana wrote, one step ahead. We were always like one step ahead of the Germans. Many things happened during that journey. I think perhaps the one that was the most horrible is to see animals dying from shrapnels from German airplanes which were bombarding certain areas. And they were doing it almost on a daily basis. So quite a bit of our walks were done in the evening. And we walked from one little town to another. And I want to mention one, that's Wengrove. It's east of Makov already, where the Jews, we were exhausted coming close to Wengrove around 10, 11 o'clock in the evening. And the Jews of Wengrove came out to meet many refugees, including us, and helping us to get up and to come to their homes where we were giving a meal and a wash and a place to stay overnight. I particularly mention the Jews of Engrove, who were so kind to us at that time. And the next morning, again after breakfast, we were on our way again to go further east. And
I imagine there were many people who were leaving home around that time.
Pardon?
I imagine there were many people who were leaving home at around that time to run away. Were many of them focused on getting to Palestine, or mostly just on getting away?
Well, I can't speak for the others. A great number of them probably wanted to escape the Germans and didn't know exactly. We were focused on reaching Palestine. We were very young. We were 15 and 17 and all alone. An episode, for instance, during the daytime, were near the town of Wishkov, which sits on a very important river, and there was a very important bridge for either the Poles to cross or the Germans, and we were lying there during the day, and it was a beautiful sunny day, September, and each time a bomb fell, the Germans tried to destroy the bridge. My younger brother was like embracing the tree that he lied next to, and all he could say is Mamelu, the mother. And then they didn't destroy the bridge, and we managed to cross it and to go further east. We went as far east as Pinsk, which was quite far. And at that point, we had to decide to go south. And in Pinsk, there was already the feeling of war, where the Polish troops were receding, and the Jews didn't know what to do. And we were going to take a train from Pinsk to go south. And there was a Jew, in the Polish officer, I believe he was a doctor, who recommended to us not to go to south at this moment from Pinsk, but to advance further east to a city called Luninets, and there go south, because the Germans were already very close to the southern part of which we were going to cross on the way south. So we embarked on a train going east. And there the train was bombarded very often. And each time the train stopped, and we were running to a ditch on the side. And when the bombardment was over, we came back and we continued on the train. I think for the third time, we decided that we are not running anymore down there. And I hid under a bench, and next to me lay another person that I didn't even know who he was. And I'm relating particularly that episode because this is how the Germans simply covered the train, the roof of the train, with bullets. One of them penetrated the roof and entered my arm and entered the back of the guy, of the person who was sat next to me. And with this wound in my arm and without a broken arm, the bullet came in and out and entered into him. So the plans of coming to Luninets were obviously changed, except again where in Luninets some Jews waited for refugees, for people like ourselves to help them. And I particularly remember a family by the name of Becker, who took us to their home. But there was no hospital in Luninets to take care of my arm. So after a night, we continued on our train south, and there the train stopped, and we found a hospital. The hospital was all in a mess, treating a lot of Polish soldiers and officers, and that was maybe a day or two before the Russians went into Poland and took the other half of Poland. If I remember correctly, it was around the 17th of September. At the hospital, there was not enough room even to give me a bed. And finally, when the Russians came, I got better attention, and they put my arms in a sling, in cast, and we stayed in the hospital for quite a while. This, of course, changed our plans considerably from going to Romania. And after a while in the hospital, we decided that we are going back to Luninets, to that wonderful family Becker that took care of us. And then I had to return for them to take off the cast. It took about 3 to 4 weeks for the cast to stay. And by that time, the Russians totally occupied the easterly part, half of the Poland, including the city of Białystok. I'm relating all this, but I think in detail it was written in the book, One Step Ahead. Excuse me. Excuse me a moment. The almost 2 years of 39 to 40 and 41, when the new war started between the Russians and the Germans, and we had to run further east. And I was one of the very few lucky ones, where my younger brother was caught in Białystok, and we never heard from him again. We were running ahead of the Germans already in Russia, coming to places like Tashkent and Bukhara, etc. And there, being very lucky of one of the few Jews which the Poles accepted into the newly organized army of wonders. And I say lucky because the Polish army was scheduled to leave Russia. And the total disappointment, of course, in seeing what was going in Russia with regards to social justice and their relationship to people, to human beings. There were a number of episodes in the book that I could relate to of how simple people were arrested for them by the Russians, and how they were treated. And so I was accepted to the Anders army, and after a while, indeed, we left Russia to a place in Persia, on the border between Persia and Iraq. And there a friend of mine and myself decided that because of the rumors that the army may not get to Palestine, but will be taken directly to somewhere else, to Europe, we decided to run away from the Polish army and to come to Baghdad, where we meet Moshe Dayan and Enzo Sireni.
So why don't we start with...
Well, it's in the book again.
Oh, but this one we can hear, can ask some questions. We can hear a little bit about those meetings, but let's start from the point where you were going to make your way to Baghdad.
Well, our way to Baghdad from the Polish army camp was a long story on the train, and with that I was dressed up as a poor Arab, and with some help of the Jewish people from a town called Kanakin on the border between Persia and Iraq, and the time in Baghdad until we made the right contact with some Jewish people, and we finally found Enzo Sireni, and that...
Well, so why don't you tell me, from when you're in Baghdad already, and you are now about to have your first contact with officials that are part of that are representing Palestine, or that are involved in the battles there, and what you...
Well, Baghdad at that time had a very nice young Jewish groups who were all dreaming about going to Palestine. The elderly, not so much, particularly the Rav Mekomi was concerned about sheltering people going to Palestine. It was a period just after a pogrom or some problems which the Jews of Baghdad experienced. Notwithstanding, there were young people who helped us, who made a contact for us. And at that time, the Eget company, the buses, were traveling between Palestine and Baghdad for all kinds of military reasons. They were hired by the British to do so. And Moshe Dayan was in Baghdad, and I believe he came with one of those buses. And it's a long story that is told in the book again, that how Moshe Dayan came and he organized the purchase or the stealing of some armament from a British Indian camp that was stationed in Baghdad or near Baghdad, and that my friend and I helped him. In fact, Moshe Dayan in his memoirs mentions the story of how he met us and how he helped bringing us back to Palestine. And it was not easy because some of the drivers, the bus drivers, were very concerned about taking two illegal boys to Palestine. But one of them, by the name of Shapira, said he would take us, and he did. And on the way back, the arms which we helped Moshe to steal or procure from that Indian camp were all packed in caskets of dead people with a certificate that they died of an epidemic, that they shouldn't be opened. And this is how the smuggling of the arms took place on the bus. And we went through the desert along the pipeline, but just before entering Palestine, which the buses were going to do normally, Moshe Dayan recommended that we get off, and he directed us to a certain place near the Jordan River, and he asked us alone to cross the river and on the other side and wait for somebody that's going to come and pick us up.
How many were you?
We were just two of us, my friend and I, all the time. Indeed, that's what we actually did. We crossed the river and we waited for a while, almost thinking of the worst, that because nobody came, and I suppose the time looked longer than it actually took. And then we saw a truck coming along, and the truck stopping roughly at that place, and what we could recognize, a Jewish guy came out, looked around, and we emerged, and indeed it was the truck from the kibbutz Maoz Chaim, which came to pick us up. And he picked us up, and we came to the kibbutz. And it's very hard to describe that, but it was a dream fulfilled, a long journey through the war and otherwise that came to an end. We were immediately given...
Okay, can you talk about that? This was, you had now been running for how many years?
We were gone from September 39 until almost September, because during the high holidays on the border between Persia and Iraq, in the city of Kanakin, that's how we make the contact with the Jews there. We went to synagogue for Rosh Hashanah. So it was also the fall. So you have 40, 41, and 42, 3 years, a journey of 3 years.
So you've been journeying for 3 years now, running away, and with a destination in mind. And now you finally cross the Jordan.
It's hard to describe the emotion and the feeling. And the first shower we got outside, and the clothes we received from the kibbutz, and entering the hadarochel of the kibbutz, and listening in that evening, which I'll never forget, the voice of a woman singing, I think in a shower or somewhere. It's very hard to describe the emotion and the feeling, but it was a dream fulfilled. And so we stayed on the kibbutz, and we went to work the next morning, and we probably, our health came back, and we strengthened ourselves, and we stayed there for a while. And now you want me to continue again? Because again, it's in the book.
I know, but this way I think we can get it on... Did
Okay.
you feel safe finally? Did you...
Well, I can relate to you a few episodes. Of course we felt safe because we were given false תעודת זהות, identity cards, which the Sukhnut prepared for us. And I can tell you of a trip to Afula after a month or two. And the first time seeing a stand with chocolate after 3 years or so. And those are little things which one remembers. But during the stay in Maoz, my friend had an aunt in Kfar Saba who was a doctor. And she came there, I believe in the 20s. And when she realized that her nephew and another friend arrived from the burning Europe, and we are in Maoz Chaim in the kibbutz, she sent us clothing, a shirt for him and a shirt for me, or shoes, etc. And the question, of course, started coming up in our minds, what's next? What next? My friend, who was a linguist, and immediately, and with the help of his mother, of his auntie, started thinking about going to the Hebrew U and to continue his studies. And I, because I was inclined to art and architecture and engineering, I was thinking about going to Haifa and being accepted to the Technion. And again, with the help of his aunt and some other people, I find a place to live in Haifa and a job. And with the help of the Technion, my Hebrew was quite good, still from Poland. I got tutoring both in Hebrew and others. And in the fall of 1943, which was just about a year later, a little less, I was again one of the happiest people on earth when I received a formal letter that I was accepted to study at the Technion.
Now, what's happening now in Palestine? Now, you're living in Palestine, and what's happening now in terms of defense, or have you giving any thought to you're at this point, you're about 20 years old.
Well, I was exactly 21 years old. Well, being young, at 17 or so, and traveling to Russia, etc., I must say that to a certain extent, it was not just running in fear all the time. It was like discovering new places, new cities, new buildings, new art, new places of interest, new beauty. It was, which you could describe with the Hebrew word of almost like an arpatka, which is, what's the right translation of arpatka? It would be like, I'll think about it, yeah. But times in Haifa that you asked a moment ago, as a student, were very tough. There were no scholarships. There was no help. And Technion was an institution of about 500 people, students, totally self-supporting. And tuition was one of those things whether you had to pay, whether you were poor or rich. So I did many, many jobs during that time. Worked nights, starting from being a graffeur to being an instructor, and later on a teacher at the Aryeh school in Haifa. And after a while, I got in touch with my relatives. My mother had a brother in South Africa and in England and in France. The one in France did not survive, but his family survived. And the one in South Africa that I was corresponding with him was very kind to me. And he sent me a monthly stipend, but not enough to really pay tuition, make a living, but still helped me a great deal to go to school. The time spent with a group of more Polish boys and girls who arrived near the Technion and some Israelis was one of recovering from the war, enjoying the studies in life, and going on Saturdays to Kayat Beach and swim in the sea and come back, and of course joining the Haganah quite early and receiving some additional training, especially that I had some training from the Polish army, so it came in very handy at that time.
How did that come about, joining the Haganah?
Well, that was very easy because most of the boys at the Technion, if they did not belong to the more extreme organizations, they belonged to the Haganah. And I joined the Haganah. We were trained near the Emek Israel. There were some places over there near Tivron, near Mishmar HaEmek, and but we still had to continue with our studies, and more important, we had to continue to make a living, and so we needed to work in addition to that. And the great euphoria, of course, was in 47 when the United Nations finally decided on the partition and the establishment of the State of Israel. And early 48.
Can we I want to come back to that in a second, but at this point, did you know yet what had happened in Europe? Did you know?
No. We had no idea whatsoever of what's happening in Europe. It was, when you say at this point, you mean until 45, 46? No. It's only when the war ended, and even a short while after it ended, that we heard of what happened. And yet, there was still a sense of disbelief that my own parents or my sister might have perished. But finally, the story came true. And at that time, and this is another part of my life before the War of Independence, at that time I was selected to go back to Europe and to help bring back the She'erit HaPlita. But because I was illegal and I didn't have a Palestinian passport to travel, the authorities, the Yishuv, the Haganah, took me to Zichron Yaakov, where the rabbi's name was Azrieli. My name before, incidentally, was Azrielevich. It was not Azrieli. I should have started out maybe with introducing myself as Yehoshua David Azrielevich, and in Yiddish, Shio Dovet Azrielevich. The rabbi in Zichron registered me as an Israeli born, and he gave me the name of Azrieli. He changed it, and that's how I remained Azrieli until today. And he gave me, and according to the registration of a Palestinian born, I did get a Palestinian passport. But then the news came, and I became quite sick for a while. And my departure to Europe was postponed from time to time. It was postponed until 47, late 47, early 48, where I joined the Haganah. I joined the Haganah actually earlier, and by the spring of 48, I was taken to an officer's course near Netanya in a place called Machane Dora, where I already started in the organization of a proper army.
Do you remember, we mentioned it for a second before, November 29th, 1947, do you remember how you felt? Or?
Of course, I mentioned the euphoria, the feeling about it. Haifa was one of the places where the Arabs started fighting earlier, even in 47, and snipering from the lower part of the city into the Hadar, where I lived near the Technion. And the excitement, the euphoria was quite great. A great number of my friends from the Haganah were already active, and one of them was killed on the bridge north of Haifa. The story are there in the book.
If I can ask, how did the contrast feel from the time running away from Europe, where there was a certain powerlessness because you needed to run, and people were killed, to now somebody, one of your friends, being killed in defense of.
Well, of course, there is a big difference. The decision to join the Haganah and later on to join the army, which was forming early in 48, was a conscious decision with the knowledge that one is going to fight for our own independence, and with the knowledge that one may get killed. But there was not a question of comparison. My recollection of Poland before the war was not totally powerless. We had our organizations, we had our Jewish life, which was very active and very colorful, and also quite very happy. So there was not a powerless kind of a situation. But the attitude of freedom, of living in our own country, of fighting for our own country, was not there. And that was the basic difference.
Where were you when the state was declared?
Well, that's a very good story that I can tell you. I mentioned before that I was already in an officers' training camp near Netanya by the name of Machane Dora. And on the day the state was declared, which was on the 15th of May, and it was a Friday. And of course, I'll never forget that. The excitement in the camp was great. The anticipation was great. And the news that came over the radio about the 7 Arab states, their armies ready to cross into what was Palestine, was quite clear and was coming across nearly on the hour. Towards the afternoon, the feelings became even more more in anticipation of what's going to happen. And we all assembled in a big mess hall. That was a camp built by the British. And there was a mess hall. And there was beer there too. But the windows were already covered with black paper to block out the light. But even with the windows blocked out, the lights were simmering and there was no big light coming on. And towards the afternoon, a hush fell through the mess hall. And I think the mess hall must have contained a few hundred young soldiers, like myself, and waiting on the radio for the proclamation of the state. It finally came through, and we all listened to Ben-Gurion with great deep feelings, in silence, total silence. And when he finished, the silence continued. There was not a murmur in the hall. And a friend of mine, also a student from Technion, got up on one of the tables and he sang, what I heard for the first time then, the song Be'arvot HaNegev, already about the Jewish boy, the soldier, who fell in the Negev. It was moving people and myself to tears with the event that was historic event that was happening and the role we had to play into.
Did you then fight? Did you have, were you You had been doing training up until that point.
Yes. The officers' course after the 15th, after the proclamation of the state, or maybe a few days later, was dissolved. And new young immigrants started coming in en masse, by the hundreds, by the thousands. And we became the cadre of forming a new brigade with many of the young Olim who were escaping Europe and getting off the ships. And I was assigned to a new brigade, was the Hativa Sheva, the 7th Brigade. And the 7th Brigade eventually was also designated to help free Jerusalem. And the stories are there, of course, but to relate it shortly, I was in the 7th Brigade near Latrun, and we had some successes and some not very good times. At one night we were marching to a certain destination and we didn't get there on time. And we were pinned down in one of the hills by the Arab Legion, sniping at us, and boys falling right by our sides. There were a number of people, particularly the platoon officer, a friend of mine from the Technion, who took over because the platoon commander was killed. His name was, he also passed away recently, Ofer Avisar. And I was the junior officer. And by the time towards the evening, and I was also hit by a shrapnel over there, but not terribly badly. I stopped the bleeding. And towards the evening, a rescue party arrived, and I'll never forget that, with new arms, new ammunition that just arrived from Czechoslovakia, where you could still see the greased wrappers on the floor, on the ground of the Chorsha. And we evacuated the wounded, and I became terribly sick. I was dehydrated and wounded, and I was spent a short while in a hospital, and later on I was transferred to the Air Force, where I became the educational and welfare officer for the north of the Air Force.
Was there a certain point that you felt that you belonged, that you felt that you were, there were many people who came that were sabras that were with you, and you were an immigrant that had come. Was there any point where you felt that now you belonged, or was it instant, or was it?
I always belonged. It had, from the day I stepped into the kibbutz Maoz Chaim, I felt I'm home and I belonged. It was never a situation that I did not belong. And although I went through my first years in Palestine with greater difficulties than boys of my age or even younger, because they entered Technion immediately after high school, and they had homes and they had financial support, but I was not a stranger. I discovered neighbors from Makov in Bitan Aaron, that's a small moshav near Kfar Vitkin, where I used to come down for weekends and help in the field and get away from the city. I was part of it.
Looking back,
Pardon?
Looking back now, 60 years later, any regrets on your journey to and your participation in Palestine?
No, absolutely not. No regret. The contrary. I recall those years in Haifa, the Technion, almost 7 years from the fall of 43 until the winter of 1950 as one of the best years of my life. And I feel that it has formed me to be part of the Jewish state forever.
So the impact of being here
Can't hear you.
during those critical years and being here for the founding of the state and being a participant. So the impact that has on the rest of your life.
Of course it did. As I said before, the few years I spent in Haifa had an enormous impact. The time I spent in the Technion, the fact that I was able to study and do things that I liked and I loved so much, the social life, the growing up and trying to catch up of the 3 lost years during the war in the torn Europe and Russia, all that had an enormous impact on me.
The type of people that you met while you were here, the type of lifestyle that it was, the chalutzim.
When now, at that time?
At that time.
Certainly. I met some wonderful people, and some of them are still my very good friends to date. Being a student and working very hard, I did not have that much time to mingle, and also the free time that we had were taken away by the Haganah. But we enjoyed life, we loved it. We were young, hopeful, full of energy, great ambitions, great expectations.
Is there any message that you would want to pass on to your children or grandchildren from that era, from?
Certainly. The most important message is see things in a very optimistic way in life. Try to see the beauty of life. The beauty is around you. All you have to do is reach out and see it and feel it. And do things that you like to do in life and be part of your society, be part of the Jewish people, and if your means help you, give back to others. Okay?
Thank you very much.
זהו. Now, when you asked me about what impact it had on me and on my life, I had to add that I was very much involved in the community in Montreal, where I finally settled, and I met my wife there and my children were born. And at one time I served as the Canadian National President of the Canadian Zionist Federation, as well as the President of the Technion Society. And during my presidency of the Canadian Zionist Federation, I felt how little people know about the Zionist movement in Canada. And I promised myself to write a history of the Canadian Zionist movement, where not only Jews, but non-Jews were involved, particularly during the War of Independence. It took me a long time to assemble and to collect and to write, but finally this spring, which is in which is in 2008. I find a publisher, a very well-known Canadian publisher, who agreed to publish the book, and this is the book, Rekindling the Torch, which incidentally now in the fall, it has made the best-selling, number 2 on the best-selling list of non-fiction. And I'm very, very, very proud of it. Makes a very good read on how Canadians for over 100 years have related to Zionism, to the Jewish state, and to the Jewish people. And this you can give to Eli, you give it to you. You read it too, but you give it to him, or to his father.
Okay.
Yeah.